Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. It is time for more mystery stories. I'm going to tell you about 3 new stories tonight to entertain you, relax you, or lull you to sleep. First, we will follow the Donner Party, an expedition of dozens of pioneers on their way to California in the 1840s. They got lost and trapped in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada and had to survive for months until they were rescued. The fate of the Donner Party is actually not really a historical mystery in the sense that what happened is well known. It will give us the opportunity to talk about the American Far West in the 19th century, when waves after waves of migrants settled in the Midwest and the Pacific coast. After that, our second story of the night will be about Oak Island, a small island in Nova Scotia, Canada, that is known for various theories and stories about buried treasures and historical artifacts. It has attracted treasure hunters for a very long time. And finally, our third story will be about the Bermuda Triangle, a region of the Atlantic Ocean that has acquired a mysterious reputation for the disappearance of ships and aircrafts. We'll see where it comes from and what this is based on. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. If you are so kind, please subscribe to my channel and click the like button. This does help support the channel and limits ads as much as possible. Please also follow us on Facebook for announcements. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are listed in the description of the video and also pinned in the first comment. Also below, you will find links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, as these may be better options for you. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders. Release the tension in your facial muscles too. Relax your entire body and allow the sound of my voice guide you through this journey. The first story about the Donner Party may be a bit sinister. It didn't end well. So if you find it too dark, you may want to go straight to the second story. In 1846, a group of almost 90 immigrants left Springfield, Illinois, and headed west to California. At the time, the United States was still a young country that looked very different from what it is now. 60 years after its independence, the country covered only the eastern half of its modern territory, with its frontier reaching Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas. Beyond these, there were claimed territories, including a large part of the Midwest that the U.S. had bought from France in 1803, known as the Louisiana Purchase. However, for the most part, these lands were not yet organized by U.S. government. The states on the East Coast, from the Mississippi River up to Michigan in the north, plus Texas, existed, but the rest of the modern United States was still territories or belonged to other countries, especially California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, or New Mexico, which belonged to the recently independent state of Mexico. Like for the U.S. in the Midwest or the Northwest, these were more claims than actual possessions at this point, because they were mostly empty of Mexican administration, but not empty of people. The population was scarce, given the distances, but there were numerous Native American tribes that had lived on these lands for generations. In the 1840s, all of these frontiers were moving fast, and the U.S. government was more willing than ever to expand in North America to reach the Pacific. Texas is separated from Mexico and became an independent republic, which lasted for 10 years until it was annexed in 1845 as a 28th state. And just a few months after the departure of a group to the west in 1846, the war with Mexico had started, which ended in the annexation by the United States of a big chunk of its current territory in the Southwest. But beyond the maps, the human reality of it was a growing flow of settlers who left their homes in the East to resettle in the West, either in the Midwest, the Great Plains, or all the way to California or the Oregon Territory. The Oregon Territory was a large area in the Northwest disputed with Great Britain that later became the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and parts of Wyoming and Montana. In order to reach the West Coast, there was a possible route by sea. However, the distances were enormous. The Panama Canal did not exist yet, so ships had to sail from the East Coast to the very south of America, enter the Pacific, and then make another very long leg north along the Pacific coast. In total, the journey by sea was almost 15,000 miles, the equivalent of more than half the circumference of the Earth. Alternatively, most settlers chose the land route. It was not much slower and way more affordable. The journey was long and dangerous, but immigrants were motivated by several things. Economic opportunities, such as the promise of owning land and improving their living conditions, and social status, freedom, because American society, cities, and communities in the East and the South had already been established for several generations, and opportunities for newcomers to find their place or live as they wished were not always available. For example, many religious communities emigrated to the West during this period. Yet another motivation could be a willingness to escape legal or financial trouble. Disappearing into the Wild West was the perfect opportunity to start over and never have to face the problems of a previous life. Immigrants in the United States in the 19th century could be very mobile and relocate several times. The Donner Party is an example of this. It is called the Donner Party after two brothers. George Donner, who was 60 in 1846 and had gradually moved west in his life. He was born in North Carolina and moved to Kentucky, Indiana, and finally Illinois. He was accompanied by his wife and several children. His younger brother, Jacob, also joined the party with his wife and children, as well as employees like teamsters and handymen. The two brothers were joined by another family, the Reeds, headed by James Reed, who expected to leave financial worries behind by disappearing into the Wild West. He also expected the warm climate of California to help his wife, who suffered from poor health. It was common for immigrants to form wagon trains and travel together for the entire journey or parts of it. Some of them were poor, but not all of them. They carried a few possessions and sometimes gold or silver that they would spend to settle once they arrived at their destination, or to buy help and equipment along the way. And this was the case here. The Donners were relatively wealthy. The Reeds, too. They had enough resources to hire help, and they started their journey with 9 wagons for 32 family members and employees. Other families that would join them along the way had similar profiles. Some were poor, but most traveled with possessions and animals, especially oxen. Now let's take a look at these covered wagons, because they are one of the most obvious icons of this period, when settlers moved west in ever-growing numbers. These wagons have their origin in the East in colonial times during the 17th and 18th centuries. Roads and paths were underdeveloped, and the heavy loads had to be carried around in colonial America and Canada. At the time of the Independence War, and still in the 19th century, there was a specific design in the eastern United States and Canada called Conestoga wagon, which was large and heavy and could carry up to 6 tons. It was drawn by horses or oxen. The typical covered wagon of the America West is a lighter design, an evolution of these Conestoga wagons, because they would have been far too heavy for the variety of landforms and climates they would have to cross. Lighter covered wagons could also be drawn by a single animal, like an ox or a horse, which was yet another advantage. So, thanks to their reliability, the shelter they offered in case of rain or snow, and their affordability too, covered wagons became very widely used from the Great Plains to the West Coast. They gained the nickname Prairie Schooner, and they could have different sizes or shapes, but generally, overland migrants fitted the wagon with 5 or 6 bows of wood or metal that arched high over the bed, and over this they stretched cloth The picture of covered wagons traveling across the plains, the deserts or the mountains alone, or in a group, with their white cloths like sails of a ship crossing the sea, was an instant hit in engravings or photography, and later in films. So they became a romantic symbol of the American West in the past 150 years. But contrary to the typical wagon in Westerns, most of the time they were drawn by oxen rather than horses because it was more reliable, less expensive, and almost as fast. Progressively covered wagons disappeared as a means of transportation with the arrival of the railroads and later, of course, motorized vehicles. But for decades they remained familiar from the Midwest to the Pacific coast. And it is in this context that the Donner Party left Illinois for California. The journey was expected to last months and be exhausting, especially for some of the members of the group. James Reed's mother-in-law, who was coming along, was 70, and indeed, she passed away just a few weeks after departure. But overall, the migrants were optimistic. They were curious and happy about the new life that awaited them, or so they thought. The beginning of the journey went well. The destination for the first leg of the journey was Independence, Missouri, which was 250 miles west of Springfield. Nowadays, Independence has more than 100,000 inhabitants, but in the 1840s, it was a frontier town, a big village that was booming thanks to business of outfitting pioneers. Like other towns on or close to the Mississippi River, it was at the start of the route to the west, like the California Trail or the Oregon Trail. We'll come back to this later. The Donner-Reed group reached Independence in a month, in May 1846, and made its last preparations for a long journey through the Wild West that was expected to last 4 to a maximum of 6 months, meaning that they should have arrived in California at some point in the fall and traveled during spring and summer. Within a week of leaving Independence, the Donners and the Reeds, with their 9 wagons, joined a larger group of 50 wagons that was following the same trail. And despite minor problems that were to be expected, like rain and a rising river, they advanced according to plan. By mid-June, a month after leaving Independence, they had traveled 450 miles, and their next destination was Fort Laramie in Wyoming. This fort was a trading post founded 10 years earlier, through which many trains of pioneers transited on their way to the west. It was located just before a long climb to the Rocky Mountains, and the trail that passed through Fort Laramie led to South Pass, which was known as the best point to cross the Rocky Mountains because it was the lowest point. The party crossed the Rocky Mountains following the established trail. Their next destination should have been Fort Hall, north of the Great Salt Lake. After reaching there, the train split. One route to Oregon went northwest, while another route, known as the California Trail, went southwest. Looking at a map, the safer and already explored trail was not the most direct one. It went north to what would later become the state of Idaho, and then south through Nevada. These trails were still relatively recent for migrants, having been explored and established in the 1830s. Trail guides and explorers were still searching for shortcuts or easier routes at that time. One such man, called Lansford Hastings, had explored an alternate route south of the Great Salt Lake through Utah's desert before rejoining the established California Trail. To publicize his shortcut and offer his services as a trail guide, Hastings left letters and signs along the pioneers' routes. He also sent riders to distribute letters to traveling migrants. He attempted to attract travelers to an alternate trading post called Fort Bridger, where his cutoff began. By mid-July, the large train that included the Donners and the Reeds received these letters. Hastings promised to shorten their journey to California by more than 300 miles, and some people expressed interest. However, others were more cautious or were already headed to Oregon and uninterested in a shortcut to California. As a result, the wagon train split. The majority chose to follow the established trail via Fort Hall, while the minority decided to explore the possibility of the shortcut and went south to the alternate trading post, Fort Bridger. From there, they would have the option to either take the shortcut or return to the regular trail. The group had relatively heavy wagons and many children, many more than others, which made it less adept at traveling through rough terrain. What they couldn't know was that the Hastings shortcut was very far from a smooth route they had been promised. It was indeed shorter, but also harder to travel. A journalist who was traveling on the trail and had a bit of advance tried to warn them to avoid it at all costs, but the letter he left for them at Fort Bridger never reached the group. In reality, Fort Bridger was privately owned, and its owner hoped that the Hastings cutoff would become a regular part of the trail to California, because this would have meant much more business for him with the growing waves of pioneers. So when they reached Fort Bridger, they were advised to try the shortcut and to head south of the Great Salt Lake through the Wasatch Mountains, where Hastings claimed there was an easy passage. The truth was that at this moment in time in 1846, no wagon train had ever crossed the south part of the Salt Lake Desert. Only a few men with no wagons and no children. At this point, there were 89 people in the party, and it needed a leader. This is when it officially became the Donner Party. George Donner, a mature and experienced man appreciated for his peaceful character, was chosen. Apart from the Donner and Reed families, several other families had joined the train since departing from Independence and decided to go south to Fort Bridger and take the shortcut when the large group had split a few days earlier. crossing of the Wasatch Mountains turned out to be much more complicated than promised and caused the party to lose 18 days, which was concerning because they had to arrive in California before winter. There were still hundreds of miles of mountainous or desert lands to cross, and these regions would become extremely cold and inhospitable in the winter. In total, the month of August was spent covering a very small distance and reaching the Great Salt Lake. The crossing of the desert was yet another ordeal for the Donner Party. In the heat of the day, the moisture underneath the salt crust rose to the surface and made it gummy. The wagon wheels sank into it. Water was nearly gone, and the days were terribly hot, while the cold at night was hard to bear. During the crossing of the desert, which took 6 days, instead of the 2 that had been promised, several oxen were lost and had to be abandoned. The little remaining faith the migrants had in the shortcut completely vanished. However, they kept advancing and reached springs on the other side of the desert where they could recover and continue their journey. They finally rejoined the regular California Trail on September 26, 2 months after embarking on the so-called cutoff. The shortcut had delayed them by probably a full month. The summer was now over, and there were still hundreds of miles ahead. Each year, starting in spring and over the summer, thousands of pioneers crossed to the west, and time was very important because they could not afford to be trapped by winter. Wagon trains for 1846 were now well ahead, or even had already arrived at their destination. The Donner Party was at the back of the queue. It was slow and already late, which was concerning, of course, but what are these trails followed by pioneers exactly? There had been explorers on land in North America since the 16th century, but for a long time, until the late 18th century, most colonization, except in Mexico and Central America, was limited to the coastlines and islands. There were not that many settlers interested in traveling far inland in unknown and sometimes hostile regions. This changed dramatically in the 19th century when the Great Plains and the West Coast received wave after wave of immigrants from the eastern United States or even directly from Europe. The rush to the West Coast, particularly California, really began in the 1840s. It was fueled by sometimes poor living conditions and always by the hope of a better life, freedom, a new start, and wealth in the 1850s. This accelerated even more with the California Gold Rush, when gold was discovered. This would happen a few years after the Donner Party. Various routes for migrants that could be crossed by people and their wagons were explored and formed networks that served throughout the 19th century. Even after the construction of railroads, they declined, but were still used. There were 2 major groups of trails. one that typically started in Missouri, especially the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail. They were one single route and then they separated depending on the destination. The Mormon Trail was shorter as it ended in Utah and implied a 3-month journey. On these 3 trails, historians estimate that at least 500,000 immigrants traveled to the West in 25 years, when they were the main alternative between 1843 and 1869. Another group of routes to California started in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and these were southern routes that ended in Southern California. There was the Southern Trail that followed the modern frontier with Mexico through Arizona, or the Old Spanish Trail, also from Santa Fe, but more northern through Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. The Southern Trail would be used all year round, but was as hard as the others because of the deserts and mountains it had to cross. For the Donner Party, by the end of September, the situation was serious but not desperate. They had been able to return to the regular California Trail without losing any men, only animals and materials, in their disastrous attempt to use a shortcut. But unfortunately, the worst was still to come. It was late in the year now, and they were alone on the trail, with no other groups or wagon trains following them. There were tensions in the party also that had accumulated during the hardships of the past weeks, and things did not improve. The party began to split into smaller groups centered around the families. They also encountered Native Americans who joined them for a short time, raising hope as they could find assistance in the mountains where each day became colder. However, after a couple of days, the natives stole or shot several oxen and disappeared. A prominent member of the party, James Reed, the head of the Reed family, was involved in a fight and stabbed a young man to death. As a result, he was banished from the party and left alone. He agreed to proceed and try to reach the Sacramento Valley in California to find supplies and returned to rescue the party. It was now well into October, and they still had a stretch of desert ahead, followed by an even more formidable obstacle, reaching the Central Valley of California, the Sierra Nevada, another high mountain range with peaks above 14,000 feet. Until the Hastings cutoff, the whole party had traveled peacefully, and families helped each other, which was key to the survival of the weakest, including the elderly and children. In October, the party disintegrated. There was less and less grass on the way to feed horses and oxen, so the animals began to weaken. More and more of them were stolen by the natives because they had to spread out over a large area to feed. Several wagons were lost, and women or elders were asked to walk because other families didn't want to take them on and further weaken their own animals carrying a heavier load. Due to his inability to walk, a 70-year-old was abandoned near a stream and likely died there alone in the wild. The priority was now to reach and cross the Sierra Nevada as quickly as possible because their last resources of food were disappearing rapidly, and the first snowfall was imminent. They finally reached a pass now called Donner Pass on October 20, or more precisely, the first families of the company reached it because they had advanced separately. They had been told that the pass would not be snowed before mid-November. So hope of crossing the Sierra Nevada remained because it gave them about 20 days. However, again, luck was not on their side. Further down the trail, they began to find snowdrifts, and this year the first snow arrived on October 28, hiding the trail under a vast white blanket. Over the following days, several more attempts to bridge the pass with wagons and animals were made, but they all failed. Winter was now starting at the beginning of November, and the various families scattered over several miles and tried to establish camp. The Donners built tents. All the families found very rudimentary cabins near a lake that they tried to improve as a storm that lasted a week began to rage. They were stuck, alone. The temperatures were now falling quickly, and food was very scarce. With little experience of the wilderness, they were not able to efficiently hunt or fish in the lake. Their provisions quickly ended, and they had to resort to eating the last oxen that were now starving and freezing. Half to 2/3 of the migrants were children. Once meat disappeared, ox and horse bones were boiled to make soup until they became so brittle that they disintegrated. A week later, children began to boil or roast leather to eat it. Some of the men died, including Jacob Donner and his brother George Donner, who had an injury to his hand that had become infected. In January 1847, death by starvation, cold, or disease was taking people almost every day. On the other side of the Sierra Nevada, the fate of the Donner Party was not entirely unknown. James Reed, the banished member for murder, had managed to cross and tried to return to the party with supplies. There were also other migrants who had traveled from these families earlier before splitting, when they decided to try the Hastings cutoff. And they warned that the Donner Party was probably still a prisoner of the snow somewhere along the California Trail. To make things even more complicated, the war between Mexico and the United States was raging. There were sporadic fights in California, and it was not a large-scale conflict, but it made it more difficult to organize and send the rescue party. Finally, 3 groups marched east in February and March and reached the remains of the Donner Party with food and blankets. Out of almost 90 people, half had died, and the survivors were in terrible condition. A rumor appeared that they had to resort to cannibalism to survive. This is actually very uncertain. Many survivors disputed this claim. It has never been proven beyond doubt. In any case, women and men who survived the ordeal all remained traumatized by these long weeks of waiting, tortured by hunger and cold, from November to March with close to no hope of being rescued. 89 people had left Fort Bridger in July 1846, and only 48 escaped the snow of the Sierra Nevada. The story of the Donner Party quickly reached the rest of the United States. It appeared in newspapers in 1847, and together with the war, it contributed to a temporary decrease in the number of pioneers on the Westward Trails. But this didn't last long, and the migration by land to the West Coast never ceased. The survivors settled in California, and the last of them, who were children at the time of the disaster, died in the early 20th century. Mortality was very different depending on age and genders. The highest mortality rate was among men above 20 years, which is attributed to a combination of behavior and metabolism. Men tended to take on the riskiest tasks and venture more outside of the shelters. There were other reasons too. Adult men tend to have less body fat than women and metabolize proteins faster. The highest mortality rate was among single men, probably because they didn't have a family to share food with and they didn't own cattle. Infants also had a high mortality rate, obviously because they were more fragile. The survival rate of women was higher, and another group that had a higher chance of survival was children between 6 and 14, because until the end, these people try to keep them alive. They may have lost a lot of their ability to socialize. As the disintegration of the party shows in the last month, then they kept taking care of each other's children, and their sacrifice was not in vain, because a majority of them survived until they were rescued. The Donner Party is remembered as the most spectacular tragedy for pioneers in the record of American westward migration, which was dangerous, but never as many in a single episode. And now, for our second story of the night, we're going to move to the other side of North America and explore Oak Island in Nova Scotia. Oak Island is a fairly small island in Canada that has attracted a lot of interest from treasure hunters since the 19th century. It has acquired a reputation for hiding fabulous treasures and maybe even ancient artifacts, from the Holy Grail to Shakespearean manuscripts. There is even a rumor of a curse saying that 7 men will die in the search for the treasure before it's found. To date, 6 men have died looking for it. But first, let's take a look at where we are now and what this mystery is about. Oak Island is a part of the Canadian province of Nova Scotia on the Atlantic, and it is fairly easy to access because it is located just 200 meters, about 650 feet, from the shore. It is even connected to the mainland by a causeway that was built in the 1960s. It is relatively cold, like the climate of Nova Scotia, and also covered with the kind of forest you find in the southeast of Canada or in New England. But with a humid climate and the effects of the ocean, it can be hidden in fog regularly for as many as 3 months a year. Occasionally, there are also powerful storms and hurricanes. The island is actually quite small at 240 acres, and it doesn't have a permanent population. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the region was populated by natives, especially the Micmac. For several thousand years, they have had a presence in the overall area. The earliest European residents in the bay around the island were fishermen from France in the 1750s. The waters around Nova Scotia and Newfoundland attracted many West European fishermen in the 17th and 18th centuries because they were extremely rich in fish. Following the 7 Years' War, the French descending residents of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were expelled, and the local government encouraged the settlement of the area by other colonists from New England especially. In the 1760s, the new settlers arrived from Massachusetts, and Oak Island was officially divided into lots that became privately owned by various families. Since then, the island has remained privately owned and has changed hands many times. It was visited intermittently by treasure hunters because, in reality, its reputation started appearing more than 200 years ago. And for as many years, parties have traveled to the island to start all sorts of searches. So much so that the causeway to the mainland was built in 1965 to easily bring heavy machinery. But how did it begin exactly? It's hard to know because the earliest accounts of treasure hunts began in the 1790s, but they left no written trace and are known only by word of mouth. The first stories to appear in print are from 1857, several decades after rumors about the treasure on Oak Island began to spread, which gave a lot of time for these stories to change and be amplified or even forgotten. The original story by early settlers tells of a dying member from the crew of the famous pirate Captain Kidd. Captain William Kidd, who would have stated on his deathbed that a treasure worth £2 million had been buried on the island. Captain Kidd was a Scottish sailor from the 17th century. He was tried and executed for piracy. You couldn't find exploits or spectacular feats in his career. There are none. And he didn't become famous as a brilliant pirate. Some historians even considered that he was unjustly tried for piracy. His legend appeared because of a belief that he had left buried treasures in various places. Oak Island is one of them, but there are more. There are also stories about other treasures on Long Island or Suffolk County, New York, 3 more in Connecticut, and yet another one in Canada, in the Bay of Fundy. As far as we know, none of them has ever been retrieved. However, these rumors inspired many accounts and novels, like Treasure Island by Stevenson, and thus formed the legend of Captain Kidd, the treasure hider who was executed before he could return to unearth his riches. The locals had heard about these stories of a pirate treasure on Oak Island, and in 1799, a man looking for a location for a farm on the island would have found a depression in the ground where earth was loose, not hard packed like the surrounding soil. With the help of others, he would have started digging down to 30 feet. But the story doesn't say whether he found anything. Apparently he didn't, because he didn't become richer after this. Other parties in the first half of the 19th century dug shafts, but after a while they were all flooded with seawater. In 1802, allegedly, a large stone inscribed with symbols was discovered 90 feet below the surface in one of these pits. The stone disappeared in the 19th century, if it ever existed, because some people claimed it was just a rumor that it had been fabricated in the chimney of a nearby house. Others claimed that the symbols were accidental scratches, but the stone became a famous object in the community of Oak Island enthusiasts. One researcher in the 20th century claimed that the supposed cipher on it translated as 40 feet below, 2 million pounds lie buried. However, this information is not substantiated, and the stone is nowhere to be found nowadays. In any case, this era of rumors and word of mouth ended in 1857 when the first articles about treasure hunting on Oak Island appeared in the local press. For years, it remained known essentially locally. But this was enough to draw more and more people to the island, and this time with bigger teams and boring equipment or steam pumps to try to keep the water out of the shaft. Oak Island rises only 11 meters, that is 30 or 40 feet above sea level, and the island is rather small. The exact mechanism is not fully understood, but shafts that are more than 10 to 15 meters deep or more tend to be flooded with seawater, which the treasure hunters understood quickly because the water level in the shafts changed with the tides. Several different campaigns succeeded one another on the island for decades. All of them were based on digging around the initial pit, where the depression had been found decades earlier, or in other parts of the island. They almost all were abandoned after a few years with no conclusive result, even though the boreholes became wider and deeper. The original pit had been nicknamed the Money Pit, even though no discovery of money or artifacts that would indicate the presence of a treasure were unearthed, as far as we know. But despite the absence of finds down and around the Money Pit, it kept attracting treasure hunters and investors because there is indeed something weird about it. First, the earth it contains is definitely looser than the soil of the island, which suggests that it was dug first and refilled later. Second, remains of wood that could have been platforms at various levels of depth were unearthed down the pit. It is actually not established whether these were platforms, but their presence on the ground is hard to explain if the hold was not artificial, and it is puzzling to see the pit filled with seawater so easily because it is not located on the beach, and it looks almost as if the island was floating on water. So this mystery kept attracting more and more people, and maybe also the legend around the island itself, because when so many parties have explored it for more than a century, it is hard to believe that there would be absolutely nothing. So, Oak Island was never short of treasure hunters, and its mystery attracted high-profile investors over time. The most famous of them is probably Franklin Delano Roosevelt, long before he became President of the United States. He started to be interested in Oak Island in 1909. In the previous century, his grandfather had financed searches on the island, and even though he never went, he kept following any new developments in the mystery until his death in 1945. There were also high-profile actors like John Wayne or Errol Flynn who invested in treasure digs. With time, many theories formed about how the pit appeared, how it was formed, and what it may contain. Some of them try to explain it naturally, while others defend the hypotheses that it could be a man-made and speculate on what it could have contained. The leading explanation that excludes human intervention, and in that case probably excludes the presence of a treasure, is that the pit would be just a natural sinkhole. There would be limestone layers under it that water would have dissolved, making the ground collapse long ago. Then the sinkhole would have progressively filled up with debris over a long period of time, which would explain the wood buried inside together with dust and soil, making it look man-made. In support of this theory, it matches the geology of the area. There are a number of sinkholes connected to natural underground caves on the mainland near the island. Apart from the hypotheses, which suggest that it's just a natural phenomenon, many enthusiasts have proposed that it is a treasure trove emitting possibilities about its contents. Generally, these are more claims than theories because they lack supporting documents. Therefore, scientifically, they lack substance. While they are not technically impossible, skeptics argue that these treasures or artifacts could be found anywhere since there is no connection to Oak Island, Protagonist, another famous pirate. Besides Captain Kidd, the original story's protagonist, another famous pirate mentioned is Blackbeard, along with various individuals who may have wanted to hide a treasure. The Knights Templar, despite sounding outlandish, are also mentioned. However, during the Middle Ages, when the Order of the Knights Templar was dissolved, the only Europeans with knowledge of America's existence were the Vikings, who likely remained unaware of the continent's true size. Thus, the idea that the Knights Templar knew about America and how to reach it but kept it a secret requires a substantial amount of imagination and a preference for conspiracies. In the same category, the treasure would have belonged to the Freemasons. And here the timeline works better, but this is also unsubstantiated. Still, in the same group of outlandish claims, it would be a site where the Incas would have hidden a treasure to protect it from the Spaniards. The Incas lived thousands of miles away in South America, as you know, and nothing indicates they ever reached Canada or were just aware of the existence of lands so far north. There are other claims that look more reasonable because they would make historical sense. It would have been dug by Spanish sailors to hold the treasure from a wrecked galleon, or by engineers from the French army during the 7 Years' War to hide the treasury of the fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia after British forces captured the fortress. Yet another one is that the pit would be British and dug to hide loot taken during the invasion of Cuba during the American Revolution. The problem with all these theories is they don't really rely on any testimony or archives. They cannot be invalidated, but they don't explain why the diggers did not leave any other trace on the island. Ultimately, no treasure was ever found down the pit to validate these theories, unless there was indeed a treasure that fell to underground caves before or during excavation works, and the treasure would now be much deeper underground. With the growing legend of Oak Island, even more claims were made in the 20th century about what it could hide. This time, not just a treasure, but historical or mythological artifacts, the jewels of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France during the French Revolution. Many of them disappeared. Also, manuscripts that are connected to the theory that William Shakespeare did not write the works he was credited for. Instead, it would be the philosopher Francis Bacon. And the proof on manuscripts would have been hidden on Oak Island. And then there are a few other claims like the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail, often connected to the Knights Templar. Is there anything of financial or historical value on Oak Island? We don't know, but at this point, perhaps the most interesting and tangible element is the phenomenon itself that has been developing around the island for more than 200 years. The legend of Oak Island feeds itself. It takes shape because there's a constant flow of treasure hunters and now tourists and TV shows that keep coming and keep the myth alive while giving it substance at the same time. It has become hard to rule out the possibility that there is something, because that would mean that several generations have, absurdly, spent a lot of time, energy, and money for nothing. Yet, when you look for hard evidence, there is almost nothing to it. It's all about dubious artifacts that go missing before they can be studied, like the stone with inscriptions I talked about before, or secondhand oral testimonies or claims that seem more like the product of imagination rather than investigation. So, Oak Island appears to be a modern iteration of El Dorado, the land or the city of gold that the Spanish conquistadors searched for. It may be just a creation of the mind, but it is impossible to assert that there is nothing, and it is tempting to entertain the idea that maybe the next pit will reveal something. And suddenly, Oak Island will appear to be everything generations have ever dreamed of, or maybe even more. For our third story of the night, we are going to take a look at another elusive mystery that may be in the process of being forgotten right now, because it was probably much more famous a few decades ago. The Bermuda Triangle. What is it? It is hard to say what the limits of the Bermuda Triangle are because the area is loosely defined. It is a large region of the Atlantic Ocean that is often represented as a triangle between Bermuda, the south of Florida, and Puerto Rico. In the 1950s, it is not that old, various press articles started to point out unusual disappearances of ships or aircraft of this region and mysterious circumstances. More and more writers got involved in this, from pulp magazines and newspapers to book writers, and in a few years, the concept of a mysterious sea region where unexplainable phenomena happen became well known and very popular. It peaked in the 1960s and 1970s, and since then the Bermuda Triangle has remained very famous. But there is a lack of incidents to keep the mystery and the public's interest alive. Another problem is that the region of the triangle is heavily traveled. There are plenty of shipping lanes in its vicinity between Europe, North America, and the Caribbean. Cruise ships cross it, hundreds of planes fly over it every week. Even as we speak, there are probably dozens of ships traveling within the limits of the triangle, and no one doubts they could do it safely. So it is hard to sustain the theory that something weird, unexplained, is happening in this area, in this context, when nothing out of the ordinary seems to be happening for such a long time. But this doesn't mean that the concept of the triangle appeared out of nowhere. It was based on a collection of incidents that are hard to explain. In total, about 30 incidents are recorded since the 19th century. So let's take a look at some of the most noticeable. There were various ships lost in the region in the 19th century and before, but not particularly more than in any other maritime regions. So the water south of Bermuda did not draw particular attention. 20th century incidents are more significant and better documented. Chronologically, the first major incident in the 20th century is a tragedy that happened long before the 1950s. The unexplained disappearance of the USS Cyclops in 1918. The U.S. Cyclops was a large collier, a ship built to transport coal and other mining products. Like ore, it belonged to the U.S. Navy. The ship departed the island of Barbados with a load of manganese ore and suddenly went missing without a trace, including a crew of 309 people. Nothing was ever discovered, no wreck, not a single body, as if the ship had suddenly vanished at an unknown location. The reason for this remains mysterious today, even though several explanations are possible. It could be because of a storm, or the ship could have been sunk by a German submarine. In March 1918, the First World War was still raging. Or it could be the consequence of an overload that would have broken the ship, because later, in the Second World War, two sister ships of the Cyclops that also carried similar heavy metallic loads were lost in the Atlantic. And it may have something to do with a structural failure. But in any case, the disappearance of the USS Cyclops remains unexplained. 3 years later, in 1929, a large schooner with 5 masts, the Deering, was found totally abandoned and hard aground on the coast of North Carolina. What happened to the crew is a mystery. The ship's log and navigation equipment were all gone, along with the crew's personal effects and the 2 lifeboats. It seems the ship was abandoned suddenly, but no one ever reappeared to tell what happened. To this day, this remains one of the great maritime mysteries in history. There are possible explanations not based on the supernatural, like a mutiny or piracy, but no definitive answers. The wreck of the Deering is another unexplained element that happened near the Bermuda Triangle. And then, nothing noticeable happens until 1945, 24 years later, with an even stranger incident: the disappearance of Flight 19. Flight 19 was a training flight of 5 bombers in December of that year. just months after the end of the Second World War. The goal of this training flight was to fly over water for over 350 miles, from Fort Lauderdale in Florida to the east, then to the north and back to base to complete the exercise. Some time after takeoff, radio contact with the 5 planes was lost simultaneously, and worries mounted when the Air Force realized that they didn't come back. None of them. A bigger patrol bomber with a 13-man crew was deployed to look for them on the route they should have taken above the Bermuda Triangle. It also disappeared. Maybe the rescue flight exploded because of a tanker off the coast of Florida reported seeing an explosion. And this model of petrol bombers had a history of explosions due to vapor leaks. The crew of 13 died or disappeared on top of the 14 men aboard the 5 bombers of Flight 19. It looks almost impossible that they disappeared due to a mechanical issue. There were 5 different planes, and the probability that they all went down at the same time is almost 0. So maybe it could have been errors of navigation leading the aircraft to run out of fuel. But no fully satisfactory and proven technical explanation ever surfaced. Then it accelerated 2 years later, in 1948, when a passenger flight to Bermuda disappeared above the ocean without a trace. In December of the same year, another airliner with 32 people on board disappeared on a flight from Puerto Rico to Miami. There was never enough information to determine the probable cause of the disappearance. A few weeks later, in January 1949, yet another aircraft full of passengers went missing on a flight from Bermuda to Jamaica. This accumulation of disappearances in 1948 and 1949, even though they could be attributed to mechanical problems or navigation errors that would have caused a lack of fuel, for example, were connected to Flight 19 from 1945 to the mysteries of the USS Cyclops in 1918 and the Deering in 1921, plus various other smaller incidents. All of this inspired the first article on mysterious disappearances of ships and aircraft that was published in the Miami Herald in 1950. 5 years later, a pleasure yacht was found adrift in the Atlantic, south of Bermuda. The crew was missing. A hurricane had passed nearby a few days before, but why would the crew have evacuated a boat that was not sinking and was retrieved in good condition to embark on a much smaller lifeboat? Doesn't seem to make much sense, and this mystery was never explained either. Finally, in 1963, 2 large refueling aircraft of the U.S. Air Force collided and crashed into the Atlantic, 300 miles west of Bermuda. Surprisingly, it looked like there were 2 different crash sites, as if the planes had exploded separately without contact. But it appeared, after close examination, that what looked like a second crash site on the surface of the ocean was probably, in fact, just a mass of seaweed and driftwood. Since the 1960s, no new major unexplained incidents have happened. There have been a number of ships sunk by hurricanes or small plane incidents, but nothing as hard to explain as the earlier incidents of the 20th century. And this is probably why the Bermuda Triangle is less discussed today. But even though the number of enthusiasts about this mystery has decreased, it quickly became an element of pop culture, and many books of fiction or investigation were written about it with all sorts of explanations, natural or not. In a sense, it doesn't make the study of the triangle easier because many incidents that were embellished at that time were inaccurately reported. I tried to eliminate these, the most dubious ones from the list I told you about. So, first, there are paranormal explanations, and they are quite colorful. Some of them pin the blame on ancient leftover technology from Atlantis, the mythical lost continent that is generally located in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere between Europe, Africa, and America. Another explanation, which was particularly popular in the 1950s and 1960s, attributed the events to UFOs, or more broadly, to extraterrestrials. In fact, these explanations tend to replace a strange or mysterious phenomenon with a much bigger mystery. So, in a sense, they don't really explain, they make things more uncertain, more complicated, but they're attractive for the thrill and the excitement they provide. As the Bermuda Triangle craze was rising, more critical authors examined the collection of incidents and came up with more natural possible explanations. First, by arguing that many incidents had been exaggerated and located within the triangle, even though they may have happened nearby or even quite far from it. That the area was very large, and that with this in mind, the number of ships and aircrafts reported missing in the area was quite similar, proportionally, to any other part of the ocean. And indeed, insurance premiums for ships crossing the triangle are no different to what they are for other maritime regions. We can probably trust insurance companies to take the real data into account. A possible natural explanation for some of the disappearances is the frequency of hurricanes, which in fact are powerful and destructive in this area. A lot of incidents can also be attributed to human error or technical flaws, which is an indirect human error, but a less common natural phenomenon could also take place under the waters of the triangle. On the continental shelves, underwater, there are large fields of methane, and it is believed that bubbles of gas that would leak could possibly put in peril or even sink a ship. The decreased density of the water may be able to literally suck a ship under the water, and then the powerful current that flows across the triangle, the Gulf Stream, could quickly disperse the wreckage. For all of these reasons, most reputable sources like physicists and marine and weather scientists dismiss the idea that there is any mystery and conclude that the Bermuda Triangle is an embellished, journalistic, and fictional creation, but it is still well known. And even though every single incident can be explained, many of them are still puzzling. There may not be enough of them to consider that the Bermuda Triangle is a place where a broader unexplained phenomenon exists statistically, but the incidents we know are still rather mysterious. We've come to the end of our mystery journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. And until we meet again, good night, sleep well.